Hi, everybody. This is the Hungry Math Professor here, and thank you for coming to my channel. Today, I want to discuss Chapter 4 of Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity by Richard Rorty. Chapter 4 is entitled Private Irony and Liberal Hope. And the question that I chose to be like the overarching question discussed in this chapter is, can we choose not to worship anything and still live productive and meaningful lives? So this idea of not worshiping anything came up in one of the first three chapters that I've already discussed. And the idea here is not that you can't value anything. When we say the word worship here is important, we're not saying you can't value anything or you cannot use anything to create some kind of personal meaning for your life. Personal could mean you and your partner, you and your family, you and your friends, so on and so forth. We're saying worship here should be used in some kind of ultimate sense, like worshiping the God of Christianity and thinking that that is the way, the truth, and the life, the absolute truth of the matter, or worshiping some political system like Marxism, or um, worshiping some particular philosopher or artist or any one sort of universal system that you claim to be the truth of the matter. The question is, can you not worship anything? Meaning, can you not choose any one particular overarching system for your life and yet still live a productive and meaningful life? And I think Rorty is trying to address this question in the entire book. So he's not going to maybe address the entire question in this chapter, but he is getting at this question for sure in this chapter, because it's the main charge against the pragmatist. That you're just you're getting rid of all um, metaphysical notions that could possibly organize us into as individuals, but also organize us as societies, as groups of people, and then all this left is nihilism or something like this, right? And Rorty and myself are going to say, no, that's not the only thing that's left. And so again, he's going to talk about the liberal ironist, but he wants to start by clarifying what he means by the ironist, not the liberal part. And so he first talks about how, like, the ironist is someone who recognizes that their final vocabulary. Okay, what does he mean by final vocabulary? What he means is actually what's brought up in Uncertainty by Wittgenstein. There, Wittgenstein calls it an hinges or hinge epistemology. Rorty is going to use this idea of final vocabulary, but these are synonymous as far as I'm concerned. The idea is the following, that I can be logical about my beliefs and just kind of keep going backwards in the chain of reasoning of premises and things that I believe. But at some point, I'm going to hit rock bottom. And you can think about those as axioms or somehow core beliefs or hinges in your hinge epistemology or a final vocabulary, whatever you want to call them. But there are the beliefs that I have that I cannot justify. Everything else that I believe can be justified on top of those hinge beliefs or those final vocabularies, but the final vocabularies themselves cannot be justified. I mean, the same thing happens with axioms in a formal axiomatic system. You can call them self-evident truths, but that's not really a justification. It's just a platitude that's supposed to make me feel better about them. But at the end of the day, I have to just believe these axioms or I don't, right? And he's saying that the ironist is someone who can see that their final vocabulary cannot be justified, and yet is not somehow completely unshaken into meaninglessness or anything like that. Just says, yeah, this is the final vocabulary I have. These are the values I have. And I'm not going to be able to get rid of them anyway. And they're no better than anyone else's, but they're mine. And I care about them. And that's enough to make the final vocabulary meaningful to me. But I also get benefit from realizing that my final vocabulary, my hinge beliefs are not somehow better than anyone else's. And so if I care about having some kind of stability in the world and not like devolving into some state of nature, then we have to care about other people's values and other people's final vocabularies, other people's hinged beliefs, in order to like make some kind of productive, pragmatic system that I can also benefit from in the long run, right? So that's the idea. This idea of final vocabulary is going to come up several times in the reading today, and I hope that that makes sense to you. And also, I encourage you to watch my video on uncertainty because this is very important to Wittgenstein, and I really love uncertainty. But then Rorty says, okay, I'm going to define for you what I mean by an ironist. So for Rorty, an ironist must fulfill three conditions. He's going to list out these three conditions. The first, she has radical and continuing doubts about the final vocabulary she currently uses because she has been impressed by other vocabularies taken as final by people or books she has encountered. So I take this to mean the ironist is not going to worship any one final vocabulary. Their own final vocabulary is not going to be worshipped, and no one else's final vocabulary is going to be worshipped. They're constantly willing and able to doubt their own final vocabularies and doubt everyone else's at the same time. Two, she realizes that argument phrased in her present vocabulary can neither underwrite nor dissolve these doubts. Meaning, again, as I said before, the axioms of your axiomatic system cannot be justified. Self-evident truth is not a justification. And my hinged beliefs are not justified either, right? And then the third point is, insofar as she philosophizes about her situation, she does not think that her vocabulary is closer to reality than others, that it is in touch with the power not herself. Ironists who are inclined to philosophize see the choice between vocabularies as made neither within a neutral and universal metavocabulary, nor by an attempt to fight one's way past appearances to the real, but simply by playing the new off against the old. Meaning, we are historically situated. So it's not like we're coming into this in a vacuum, right? I don't get to just completely choose exactly how I want to be. I am influenced by my parents. I am influenced by my family. I'm influenced by the fact that I'm a US citizen, that I was born in New York, that I'm born in this time period, so on and so forth. We can list so many things that influence where I find myself right now. So you might say, well, how do you choose? I can't explain to you where my values come from, but I can acknowledge the fact that I have values and they probably are influenced by all these different things I just listed off. So I'm not coming into this situation in a vacuum. It's the metaphysician, the person who thinks you need some ultimate system, who wants to try to approach this from a vacuum and try to create a system from scratch. But the ironist realizes that's never going to be possible. All languages are contingent, and all beliefs are going to be contingent as well. And so we just have to live with what we have, right? So this is the ironist. And then he points out not too long afterwards that someone who lives by common sense instead of irony, this ironist, is the kind of person, is the opposite of an ironist in the sense that they just think that their final vocabularies, their hinged beliefs are just the way it is. And anyone who's willing to challenge that is somehow crazy or just impractical, or there's some silly academic philosopher or something like this, right? Like, just use common sense. Now, it's funny because the pragmatist, in some sense, is going to want to leverage common sense in some way, but not this kind of lazy common sense that of like the typical kind of person, I think. Of course, most citizens are going to be these kinds of common sense people. There's nothing wrong with it. It's very useful for society and things like that. But the liberal ironist, the kind of person that Rorty is going to put up as somehow the ideal for the kind of societies we seem to be able to have at the current moment in our history, that kind of person is not going to be this sort of simple-minded, common sense person who just accepts their final vocabularies as being the way that things are, right? So that's the issue with this kind of common sense view. But then he wants to also describe, like, what is the metaphysician? Like, what is the metaphysician belief? So he says, the metaphysician is someone who takes the question, what is the intrinsic nature of justice, science, knowledge, being, faith, morality, philosophy, at face value. He assumes that the presence of a term in his own final vocabulary ensures that it refers to something which has a real essence. The metaphysician is still attached to common sense in that he does not question the platitudes which encapsulate the use of a given final vocabulary, in particular the platitude which says there is a single permanent reality to be found behind the many temporary appearances. It does not redescribe, but rather analyzes old descriptions with the help of old descriptions. The metaphysician responds to that sort of talk, calling it relativistic, like the talk of the ironist, and insisting that what matters is not what language is being used, but what is true. Metaphysicians think that human beings by nature desire to know. They think this because the vocabulary they have inherited, their common sense, provides them with a picture of knowledge as a relation between human beings and reality, and the idea that we have a need and a duty to enter into this relation. Let me just say at this point that I think most philosophers start out as wanting to be some kind of metaphysician. I think most of us want to believe in some kind of objective truth, some kind of absolute certainty. I certainly think that of myself. I came to philosophy wanting there to be absolute certainty. I started out as a Christian and believed very strongly, but I wanted Christianity to be absolutely certain. And eventually I realized it just, nothing is absolutely certain. But then I think in my life, I turned to maybe not even explicitly, but implicitly, I turned to science and mathematics and rationality as some kind of um, stand-in for something I was hoping could be made to be true. Maybe science is not getting at the world 100%, but in the limit, it gets closer and closer. But I have now come to the point where I've thrown all that off because I just think it doesn't work. Like under more analysis, none of these stories hold up. None of these metaphysical stories hold up. And so the question is, what do you do if none of these metaphysical stories hold up? Do you just try to do that project again, try to create a new metaphysical story that captures the fundamental truth about the world, the fundamental essence? That's one option. There's still philosophers who are trying to do that. But for me, that's just not the right conclusion to draw. Instead, we gain strength, in my opinion, from being able to recognize all the varied contingencies about how the world is and embracing the uncertainty of life. And that's what Rorty is also going to get at, right? So he's talking, when he talks about metaphysicians, I think he has in mind people like Plato and Kant and Descartes and Bertrand Russell and Frege and More and all these people who think they can provide some final system that gets at truth. Even if they haven't claimed to quite get there yet, that's what their goal is. And for Rorty and for myself, this just isn't the right goal. Okay, let me read another quote about the ironist. For the ironist, searches for a final vocabulary are not destined to converge. Science is not going to get at absolute truth, or all these different ultimate metaphysics are not going to get to some final story. For her, sentences like "all men by nature desire to know" or "truth is independent of the human mind" are simply platitudes used to inculcate the local final vocabulary, the common sense of the West. She is an ironist just insofar as her own vocabulary does not contain such notions. Right? The idea is the reason why you can be a metaphysician and like complete some ultimate system is because you just surround yourself with the people who already agree with you, right? You just create these echo chambers, and then you can live in this deluded reality where you think that you found the truth. And as soon as you come in contact with somebody who thinks differently, you reinforce your own position by just calling them stupid or simple-minded or so on and so forth. You come with all kinds of pejorative phrases to just make that other people sound stupid and reinforce your own black and white position. But that does not mean you found some kind of black and white truth, right? You're just deluding yourself. And continuing, her description of what she's doing when she looks for a better final vocabulary than the one she is currently using is dominated by metaphors of making rather than finding, of diversification and novelty rather than convergence to the antecedently present. She thinks of final vocabularies as poetic achievements rather than as fruits of diligent inquiry according to antecedently formulated criteria. Right? Again, she is responding to where she finds herself in history and deciding to create new vocabularies to try to find something that works for the present people that she's around. And it's not about finding some absolute truth or anything like that, right? It's about it's about this idea that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. She's looking for new useful models. Useful models sort of have a timeline, and eventually a model that used to be useful is no longer useful anymore. So what do? You create a new model, and you have to constantly create new models, not because they become better, but because people shift and change, and the old model doesn't work anymore, right? It's not about truth. It's about creating something that works for where we are in history right now. That's all we can do, right? So he brings up this importance of literary criticism because it's like it's not about finding the right book that gives you what truth is. Instead, it's about expanding your exposure to ideas. Because when you expand your exposure to ideas, you're more likely to be inspired to create something new off of that. And also, you're more likely to understand more final vocabularies. So he's saying literary criticism is the right thing to put in as the goal, because literary criticism is about reading books and playing books off of each other, like saying, oh, from the perspective of this book, this other book is saying this, and you just have to compare and contrast and enlarge your vocabularies, enlarge your canon of books and ideas. You're not looking for the correct foundation, right? This is a very different approach. So from an academic's point of view, the goal is to try to read as much as you can and become exposed with as many ideas as you can, and try to expose other people to as many ideas and books as you can, right? And so he talks about how literary criticism used to have a very sharp meaning, but we've actually expanded what literary criticism means now to the point where we just mean like reading almost anything and comparing it to anything else is like useful in exposing us to more and more final vocabularies. And he says that the goal is to enlarge the canon. Now, remember, Rorty's writing in 1989. Canon for him, I think, means books, right? And I think it can still mean books. I mean, I read a lot of books, but I know that people in general don't necessarily read as many books. So a question I put at this point in my discussion for you and for all of us is, how do we even reimagine the canon? Because I think it's very much in Rorty's spirit that we can reimagine anything we might need to. So a canon could still involve books, but may also need to involve podcasts, might need to involve YouTube videos, might need to involve TikTok videos even, right? Or Instagram posts, or I don't know. My point is not to answer the question, but to say one thing that we might need to expand our vocabulary about and start creating metaphors for is what the new canon would be. What's the new canon that provides some kind of cohesion to our society? Maybe even this idea of Western culture needs to be reimagined into something bigger, and that bigger reimagining might involve something that involves a bigger canon as well, where canon again is expanded to mean not just books, but something else, right? So again, our goal is to reimagine, to create new vocabularies and languages and ideas in order to create a better model that works for the people that we are right now, right? We can't go back to the past. Is something I think is really important. And now he goes back to this idea that, like, ironists help us form our private self-image, but now he's also going to criticize ironists because he wants to put forth the liberal ironist, not just the pure ironist, as his sort of the person that he thinks is the right person for the moment we're in now. So he says, ironists help us form our private self-image. They help us try to concentrate on who we want to be. Who is Brian Allen and who does Brian Allen want to be, right? Ironists are good at that. Ironists are good at pointing to injustices in our society and saying, what does this person want to be? And why are we not allowing them to rise to their full potential, right? They're the kind of people that stand up for trans rights and stand up for women's rights and all these things, which I think are important. So don't get me wrong, but he's saying that the ironist alone is unfortunately not good at politics because they are so far in one direction towards being an ironist that they tend to be anarchists. They tend to be uncompromising. They have a hard time seeing the bigger picture. And I think about this a lot when it comes to, what's the word? A lot of these social justice issues that are very important today. I think they're important as well, but I tend to see, unfortunately, this idea that when you stand up for these issues, you just should moralize. You should just say what you believe and it's true. And if people don't see what you believe to be true, then they're stupid, they're sexist, they're transphobic, blah, 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 blah. But don't forget that the goal is to persuade. The goal is to try to expand these people's rights by persuading others of that their rights are correct. So when you just strictly moralize or you become an anarchist because you're so angry of what you're seeing, then you lose the pragmatic element. You lose the ability to actually persuade people and to actually help the very people that you want to help, right? And so if you just scream moralisms that you think to be true, but no one finds them convincing, then you don't actually help the people you're trying to help, right? And I think this is the point that Rorty's trying to make. And, just as an example of someone who was able to actually expand the rights of women in the history of America, you should look at Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but in her early years, before she was a Supreme Court justice, she argued several cases in front of the Supreme Court that she wound up winning, which increased the rights for women. But what she didn't do was go in front of these nine old white men and give them moralist arguments. Just say, you're sexist, you're not respecting women, and that's stupid. And, just give these sort of moralisms to these Supreme Court justices. She would have lost every single case, and she would have not increased the rights for women at all. Instead, what Ruth Bader Ginsburg did is she understood the way that these justices thought. She understood their final vocabularies in a pragmatic way. She doesn't need to fully know who these people are. She just needs to understand their story enough to then craft an argument, but I would say craft a story which these justices could understand, and she wound up winning. And sometimes she was so pragmatic and good at this that she would just pick a man's case to argue for women's rights, because she understood that if she used a man's case in front of these nine men on the Supreme Court, that it would be more convincing to them. It's not because she thought that case was somehow the most important case. It's that she was a pragmatist. She understood, pragmatist in the sense she was practical. She understood that the goal was to win the case. It wasn't to moralize in front of these justices, right? And I think we've really lost this today. I mean, the liberal left seems more intent on and just moralizing in front of their Instagram fans or TikTok fans or YouTube fans than they are to actually pragmatically increase the rights of the people they care about, right? And I think we've forgotten how you actually do that. We've forgotten to study history and see how this is done. I'm not saying that you never need to scream in the streets, or you never need to do something that could be slightly anarchistic in order to increase somebody's rights. That's not what I'm saying. But just moralizing online is not going to do it. It's never going to work. It's not going to win you an election of the kind of person who could actually increase the rights of the kind of people you care about. Okay, let's get back to the text, but I think that is an important thing to think about. And so, again, now Rorty's going to try to shift us into liberal ironism, which is like this paradoxical tension between the ironist who cares about everybody's sort of ability to make themselves, who cares about everybody's ability to just be who they want to be, which is important. And then he wants to combine that with the liberal who wants to decrease suffering and understands that in order to decrease suffering, you may have to, there might need to be some trade-offs. There might need to be some thought about the bigger picture. You might need to compromise sometimes, or, this kind of thing. And he talks about how, like, in this ideal society, he says, we ironists who are also liberals think that such freedoms require no consensus on any topic more basic than our own desirability. From our angle, all that matters for liberal politics is the widely shared conviction that, as I said before, we shall call true or good whatever is the outcome of free discussion. That if we take care of political freedom, truth and goodness will take care of themselves. Right? So again, taking care of political freedom, creating a political system where everybody's final vocabulary has some space in the discourse, it doesn't mean that everybody's going to get what they want. That's what the ironist wants, right? But the liberal ironist understands that's not going to happen either. But if we all do our best to make everybody's voice have some space, then we'll get some kind of useful compromise and some kind of useful system. And then we'll keep changing it. We'll keep adopting it, because nothing is ever final and never ever reaches what we need, right? Okay, at this point in the chapter, he's going to bring up two criticisms of liberal ironism, and he's going to respond to them. And so the first criticism is that liberal ironism is just not substantial enough to produce social cohesion. He's saying, this ideal of, the critic is going to say, listen, this ideal of liberal ironism sounds cool. This paradoxical tension between being a liberal who cares about reducing cruelty and an ironist who cares about propping up what each individual wants to be, exactly who they want to be. This tension is cute, but it's just not possible or it's not substantial enough to create the kind of social cohesion that we need in society. And so he wants to get rid of this criticism quickly because he wants to respond to the second criticism um, more. And I think his response to the objection is the following. He says the people said the same thing when Christianity got knocked off this pedestal and societies became more and more secular. They said the same thing. They said that as societies become less and less secular, they just won't have social cohesion anymore. And he says it's just not true, right? I mean, China is an extremely secular country. Europe is a very secular country now. So is the United States and Canada, though maybe United States is the least secular of all these countries I just listed. But all these societies are way more secular than they were 100, 200, 300 years ago. And yet we don't see the complete breakdown of society. So he's saying, I'm going to get rid of this criticism right away by just saying it didn't happen when Christianity became less significant, and it's not going to happen when any other metaphysical thing gets lessened. And that's all he thinks. That's the only argument he has to make, and I do agree with him. And I'll just read a quote about this. He says, "The idea that liberal societies are bound together by philosophical beliefs seems to me ludicrous." Here, philosophical beliefs, I think, mean some kind of grand metaphysical philosophical belief. What binds societies together are common vocabularies and common hopes. The vocabularies are typically parasitic on the hopes, in the sense that the principal function of the vocabularies is to tell stories about future outcomes which compensate for present sacrifices. So an example of this would be like, the pursuit of the American dream, which seems to be unraveling in US culture now, but did seem to be a final vocabulary or some kind of hopes and vocabulary that was productive, at least at some point in the history of the United States. Maybe that vocabulary doesn't work anymore, or it doesn't work the same way, but we need to produce a new vocabulary, right? And you can also think of Trump as using this idea quite substantially in, this idea of make America great again, or all the different phrases that Trump uses. He has used it to unite people and win elections. That doesn't mean I think it's good. I think actually it's bad. But I think this idea is that he didn't use some grand metaphysical story to unite people. He simply tapped into people's hopes or fears, probably more of their fears, and gave them some kind of hope, right? And that was enough to produce some kind of cohesion enough to win elections. And he says, modern literate secular societies depend on the existence of reasonably concrete, optimistic, and plausible political scenarios, as opposed to scenarios about redemption beyond the grave. To retain social hope, members of such a society need to be able to tell themselves a story about how things might get better and to see no insuperable obstacles to this story's coming true. So he's trying to tell us how we could create a new story. He's not going to tell us exactly what that story should be because he's not alive anymore, and he's writing in 1989. But he's giving us the key to how to figure out a new story, which is, well, first of all, expand your canon, expand your exposure to final vocabularies about the United States, for instance, and then try to find a story which gives people hope, but not just gives people hope who are on the same side as you, but rather try to tap into something bigger than that. Try to tap into something that unites maybe not 100% of United citizens, that's impossible, but some substantial percentage of US citizens behind a hope and a goal and a story that we could try to achieve, right? I think that's a very wise point. Okay, and now we're going to move to the second criticism. The second criticism is the following. The second critic says, it is just not it's psychologically impossible to be a liberal ironist. So now they're making the first criticism was about, liberal ironism is just not a sticky enough glue to create social cohesion. The second critique is that even an individual cannot be a liberal ironist. It's just not psychologically possible to hold this paradoxical tension and to live that way. And he says, this idea that, liberal ironists thinks that cruelty is the worst thing we do and has no metaphysical beliefs about what all human beings have in common. That sort of combination they're claiming is just not possible. And for myself, I would say, I think I'm a liberal ironist, so I think it is possible. It seems like Rorty's a liberal ironist, so it seems possible to me. That's not his how he's going to respond, but I just wanted to offer that as a response. I've met people that seem to be liberal ironists To me, myself, Rorty, and other pragmatists seem to be able to do this. So I think it's possible. But let's look at some of the things he says about this as well, to move forward. So he talks about how this idea that the part that people don't like about ironists is that they tend to re-describe, right? I come in contact with you, maybe I find out you're a Christian, and then I, not to be an asshole, but I might bring up some questions about your foundation of Christianity. I might bring up questions that cause you to doubt. And that might make you feel humiliation because you thought that this foundation you had of Christianity was solid enough. And then when I come along and ask questions and cause you to doubt, you feel humiliated because you feel like now your foundation doesn't work anymore. And a lot of times people react to what Rorty's saying with humiliation or anger or frustration because they feel like their foundations are being disrupted. And Rorty's not saying that this is a good thing. He's not happy about doing this. He's not an asshole that wants to like dissolve people's foundations. Neither am I. I have no desire to, dissolve people's foundations that make them, do good things in their life or make them feel like they have meaning and hope and stuff like that. It's not our goal here. But he acknowledges that the ironist is going to cause you to redescribe. And what he's also trying to point out is that any sort of thing that you might point to as moral progress has required people to start redescribing and has required people to humiliate others, not because they want to humiliate, but because they have to challenge their final vocabularies in order to bring us to a new conception of how things should be. Any person who's increased the rights of women or Black people in America or gay rights or anything like that has had to chip away at people's foundations or chip away at their final vocabularies, not to be an asshole, but because they need to expand your vocabulary so that you can start to see that women deserve rights too, or that Black people should not be slaves, or Black people should also have equal rights, or gay people should be able to be married. Trans people are not scary. Like all these things require us to challenge your final vocabularies to some degree, and that produces humiliation. We're not happy about the humiliation that we're producing, but it is a necessary part of the process. And he says, what people prefer about things like Christianity and Marxism is that when they change your mind about something, they also give you this sense that you found some greater purpose. Like when you convert to Christianity, they say, yeah, you were wrong before, and that might be humiliating to some degree, but now you've just tapped into who you really are. And so that's somehow empowering in this humiliation process. And the Marxist and other ideas do the same thing. They give you this new metaphysics to hold on to. And Rorty's going to say, that's not what the liberal ironist can do. And there's something powerful about providing somebody with a new metaphysical foundation, but it's ultimately destructive because it causes you to cling to some new model and think of it as being the ultimate true model. But in reality, all models are wrong. Only some of them are useful. And all useful models eventually need to be updated to a new model so that it can continue to be useful, right? Okay, let me try to get us to the to the end of this thing here. But I think there's some really important ideas here. And again, I said this before, but really important ideas for, as I see it, U.S. political culture right now, where we find ourselves. So in the idea now is to understand, like, where does solidarity then come from the liberal ironist if it doesn't come from this like giving somebody a new metaphysical foundation. So he says the liberal ironist just wants our chances of being kind, of avoiding the humiliation of others, to be expanded by redescription. She thinks that recognition of a common susceptibility to humiliation is the only social bond that is needed. Whereas the metaphysician takes the morally relevant feature of the other human beings to be their relations to a larger shared power, rationality, God, truth, or history, for example, the ironist takes the morally relevant definition of a person, a moral subject, to be something that can be humiliated. Her sense of human solidarity is based on a sense of a common danger, not on a common possession or a shared power. So she's saying that like what we need is this idea that we all feel humiliation. And it's not just like people that look like me or people that think like me, right? It's not just liberal Democrats. It's not just conservative Republicans. that can be humiliated, that we all have this capacity to be humiliated, and that creates some big ability to see some bigger picture about our final vocabularies and things. And so the goal again is to acquaint ourselves with as many final vocabularies as possible, because then we will stop seeing people as us othered as we might see them before. We see them now as someone who's closer to how we see the world, maybe not in their particular values, but in the fact that they can be humiliated just as much as I can. We humanize them and we make them into a person worthy of being considered as part of my society in some sense. So we need to acquaint ourselves with many vocabularies as possible. Maybe we're all not going to do this because some people just don't want to read books or don't want to expose themselves to new ideas. I don't think Rorty is saying that everyone in a society needs to do this. I think he's saying it would be good if they did, but I think he's saying there's some kind of like threshold of people that we need to be liberal ironists, or maybe we need the leaders of our country to be liberal ironists, or the people we looked up to. We need to be liberal ironists. The people who capture the public's attention. He's not saying that everybody needs to do this. And so, the goal here is what he calls imaginative identification, replaces God, rationality, or truth. Like this idea of just kind of being able to keep and being imaginative about sort of the new model that's useful, imaginative about the new final vocabulary, or other people's final vocabulary, and imaginative about how we can create a wider and wider net to catch more and more people in, to reduce suffering in the world. And he talks about how solidarity is built incrementally. It's not built all in one step via a foundation. I think this is important. A lot of times today we hear people criticizing incrementalism, but I would say to them, how else do you do it? I mean, it has to be somewhat incremental, unfortunately. And I think if you look in history, it's always been somewhat incremental. If you look at, revolutions rarely help, are rarely as, directed towards the people you're trying to help as you might think if you study history. A lot of revolutions actually produce worse off conditions for the people they were trying to help than were before. And maybe revolution is a necessary part. I don't think Rorty's against that, because sometimes unfortunately, you need revolution in order to like change things and shake up the status quo. But it should be feared, because when a revolution happens, you have no clue what's going to happen next. You might cause a revolution in the name of something good, of some kind of solidarity for a bigger, a wider net of people, but then the military takes over, and then some leader takes over and just implements some new form of fascism or something like that, right? So you just can't control what's going to happen next. But at least sort of this incremental progress that we see in history, of just sort of trying to widen the net that the liberal ironist can achieve, is something that can actually happen in Rorty's view. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. One more thing I had is that, leaders are required to put the voice of the oppressed into words. Rorty talks about how, like, for those of us who care about social justice and the oppressed in our societies, these oppressed peoples do need some help from others to kind of affect the greater culture, right? They can't just advocate for themselves. They need other people who are not a part of that group to also advocate for them. And you see that throughout history. And part of what we need from those leaders, if we want to try to widen the net in a liberal society, is this sort of imaginative redescription in order to create a new story that can persuade the public, right? It's not just about moralizing in front of people. That's never going to work. It's more like this pragmatic thing that I described with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, where you figure out a story and a language and movement, right? It could involve protesting in the streets and things like that, but it needs to be something that can actually work in practice. It needs to be pragmatic. Okay, thank you for listening. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And please, anything you don't like that I've said, make a comment. I want to respond. I want to think. Our goal here is not to agree. Our goal is to expose ourselves to more people we disagree with and sharpen our ideas. At least that's how I see it. All right, thanks.